Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is Why Communion? Or we could say, Why the Lord's Supper? Each phrase, whether we call it communion or whether we call it the Lord's Supper, is biblical, and we're talking about the same thing. So we're in this series about worship and the different components of worship. And today, in this video, we're going to look at communion. Why do we take communion, or why do we take the Lord's Supper? And especially in some churches, not in all, should be in all, but it's not, it's in some. Why do we do it every week? I think that's an important question. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to start by reading a verse from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 26. We'll begin with verse 26. This is the text, and you can find a similar text in each of the Gospels, but we're going to read from Matthew, and this is the text where Jesus establishes the Lord's Supper and explains what it is that he wants his followers to do. So during their Passover meal, Jesus took a loaf of bread that they were eating, gave thanks to God, broke it into pieces, and passed it around to his followers. He said to them, "Eat this, and think of it as my body." Then he took a cup of wine, gave thanks, and passed it around to them. "As you drink it," he said, "think of it as my blood. The blood I will shed when I die will seal the new agreement God is establishing. Because my blood is going to be shed, sin can be forgiven. Think of that as you eat the bread and drink the wine." So in that particular act, Jesus was in the process of observing one very important Jewish ritual, the Passover, and he established another ritual which would become the central focus of Christian worship for the rest of time. And that's the communion, or the Lord's Supper. Now, I just said it was the central focus. I think lots of people fail to understand that. They fail to understand that that's what the Lord's Supper is, or at least that's what it's supposed to be. For 1,500 years, the church participated or ate the Lord's Supper or participated in communion every single week. Every time they met together for worship on Sunday, they took the Lord's Supper. It wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that many church leaders and church groups decided that observing the Lord's Supper every week was just too much. It took up too much time, and they wanted to get on with the more important things, the things they thought were more important, the music or the preaching or the taking up of a collection. They always had time to take a collection, but they didn't have time, they felt, to observe the Lord's Supper. And they said, well, we don't want it to become commonplace. We want it to be really special. Well, that's really I'm sorry, but that's just really a foolish argument. That's silly to say that if we participate in the Lord's Supper each week, that it will become less meaningful. That's like, if you ask your spouse, if you're a man, you ask your wife, would you get tired of hearing me tell you that I love you? Would it become commonplace? So, maybe I shouldn't say it quite as often. See how your wife responds to that, that's not going to go. The Lord's Supper is something that the church should be observing every Sunday. And if you're at a church where they don't observe it every Sunday, you ought to bring that up and talk to the leaders about it. And just remember that it wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that churches cut back on observing the Lord's Supper to once a month, or in some cases once a quarter, in some churches twice a year or once a year. And it seems really ugly to me. I'm just going to be honest with you. It seems ugly to me because this is the time where we remember that Jesus gave his body and his blood in an offering or a sacrifice so that our sins could be forgiven. And we need to remember that every week. We need to stay focused on that. The early church called it the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. And so they gathered to express their thanks to Jesus each week for what he did for saving them. And that's not something that we should lay aside as if it's unimportant so that we have more time to do the important stuff, which is spend more time on music and more time on preaching and more time on taking up a collection. And we don't really have time to remember the death of Jesus every week. That's just, see, that's ugly. I'm sorry, but there's no other way to say that. That's just ugly and inconsiderate. And if you're in a church where they don't participate in the Lord's Supper each week, then you need to talk to the leaders about that. And if they don't feel like that's important enough for them to do, then maybe you ought to look for a different church, one that takes the Lord's Supper every week, because it's that important. But there are some things that we need to think about in relationship to the Lord's Supper or their communion, as we're doing in this series, and asking, well, why do we do this anyway? Why is it so important? Well, besides the things that I just told you, and the very first one we've already talked about, is to remember the sacrifice of Jesus. That's something that we just have to be reminded of over and over and over again every week. Why every week? Well, because there's so many things that go on around us in life. We have to get up every day, and we have to go to work, and we have to take care of kids, and we have to see the problems, and we have to earn a living, and we have to help other people. And we've got all kinds of stuff we have to do. It just everything is just always there, and it's easy. It's so easy to lose focus of the really important things. And the death of Jesus and him dying for us so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be saved. There isn't anything more important than that. Nothing. It doesn't matter what it is. There's nothing more important than that. But we lose sight of it if we're not reminded of it over and over and over and over again. And that's why God established a weekly worship assembly, so that every 7 days we could come together and be reminded of these things, because it's that important and we need to remember them. And so that's the first reason why we take the Lord's Supper each week, to remember the sacrifice. The second is to proclaim the death of Jesus, Paul said, until he comes again. Usually when we're doing a communion meditation or something like that, we either read one of the passages from the Gospels about Jesus establishing the Lord's Supper, or we read from 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul is correcting the believers in Corinth because they're not doing the Lord's Supper really very well. And he says, okay, look, this is what I got from Jesus himself. This is what he told me. Okay, and then he gives the information that Jesus gave him, and part of it he added. He said, when you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So the focus of the Lord's Supper is not just the death of Jesus, but it's also the resurrection of Jesus. See, and that's an important part of the gospel, because if it's just been the death, well, then that sort of leaves things hanging, doesn't it? It's not a finished story. Jesus didn't just die. Part of the good news is that he died and he rose again. You see, the resurrection is what makes the thing come together, and it's what gives us hope. Because all of us are going to die, but death isn't the end. This isn't over when we die. That death is just a transition to another state of life. You see, death isn't the end of anything. So we need to be proclaiming the resurrection, and the Lord's Supper is the vehicle through which we do that. We proclaim not only the death of Jesus, but the resurrection. And we do this every week, over and over and over again, until he comes again. And it doesn't matter how long that is. It doesn't matter if he comes next Thursday or if he doesn't come for another million years. It doesn't matter. Christians keep doing this every week, and it proclaims the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and he's coming again, and we're all going to be raised from the grave. See, so that's one of the reasons we take the Lord's Supper each week. Another is to follow the example of the New Testament church. You see, now, there isn't actually a command in the New Testament that says, where God says, look, I want you every Sunday when you come together to do this. There isn't a command there. But when we read from Matthew, it was very clear that Jesus expected his disciples to do this on a regular basis. And historically, we know they did. We have all kinds of documents from the first century. All sorts of documents, not just the Bible, but called extra biblical documents, things that, letters and other forms of documents that people wrote where they talked about the church meeting each week and the Christians partaking in the Lord's Supper or communion. And some of the people who wrote about it didn't even understand what it was. And because in some translations, Jesus said, take, eat, this is my body, and this is they thought it was some kind of cannibalism thing, that they were literal eating the flesh and the blood of somebody named Jesus. And, the people in the first century who were not Christians didn't have a clue as to what was really going on. And they accused the Christians of all sorts of ugly things. But the fact is that Christians met each week for 1,500 years. And in not most, but many churches, they still do meet every week to partake of the Lord's Supper. And that's the central focus. The focus isn't the singing and the music. That's one of the things we do, but that's not precisely why we come. Preaching isn't the central focus. You'd think it is in most churches. We got to get all this stuff done so the preacher can get up and do his thing. Most preachers have an ego that's way, way too big for them, and they think people are coming there to hear them each week. The preaching isn't the central focus of the service. It certainly isn't giving. Okay, we do all of these things. But if you're going to narrow it down to one single purpose, a central focus for which we come to worship, it's to partake the Lord's Supper. That's why we come. And while we're there doing that, we pray, we sing, we give. We'll talk about that next time. And there's preaching. We read from the Bible. See, we do all of these things as worship to God, and that's what we meet for, is to worship. But of all the different components, the most important is the Lord's Supper. It's the Lord's Supper. And so that's one of the reasons we take it, to follow the example of the early Christians, because they understood why they were getting together. We do it also to participate together. And this is a very important thing. I mentioned this the other day. When somebody is leading prayer, I said the other day, for me it was the other day when I was making another video. I mentioned this in another video on this series, that when we come together and somebody's praying, everybody's not praying verbally at the same time. That would just be ridiculous, when nobody can understand what was being said, right? And so one person leads the congregation in prayer. Then when the preacher is preaching, one person stands up and he's talking, and everybody isn't talking at the same time, right? And when we're giving, it's one person putting their contribution in, whether it's in a plate that comes by and you put it in there, or whether it's someplace where you go and put your contribution in. That's sort of an individual thing. But when we sing, there's two elements of worship that are really where we participate together. Is when we sing, we're all singing together, praising God, and there's an important emotive element, and we're worshiping God, and we're teaching and encouraging each other in song. And the other component where we participate together is the communion. And in fact, the word communion, it is, in English, it's two words put together, common union, Okay, we come together, and in a common union, in a coming together, we excuse me, we participate together in remembering what the Lord has done for us. And that's a very important element or feature of the Lord's Supper. The togetherness part. We come together to remember what Jesus did. And that's significant. And the final reason, the last reason, is to each week refocus our thoughts and our priorities. As I said a little earlier in this video, life is so full of stuff, and they're all very urgent things, right? We have to do this today, and we have to do this today, and we have to do this, and we have all these urgent things we have to do. And sometimes the urgent things block out or get in the way of the truly important things. And so coming each week to worship and to remember what Jesus did for us helps us refocus our thinking, helps us refocus our priorities. Who is whom in this situation? Who's God? And who am I in relationship to God? Who is Jesus, and who am I in relationship to Jesus? What have they done for me versus what I do in service to them? You see, we have to constantly refocus our priorities, or our priorities get all out of whack, right? And we're not paying attention to the really important stuff. We're paying attention to all the urgent things that have to be done today, right? And that happens for everybody. That's true for everybody. Doesn't matter who you are, where you are, how old you are, how young you are, how much money you have. It just doesn't matter. All right. The urgent things tend to displace the important things in life, and we have to be careful not to let that happen. It happens all the time, but we have to minimize it and try not to let it happen very often. And one of the things that helps us with that is a weekly observance of the Lord's Supper to remind us what Jesus did. And yeah, it takes a little extra time out of the assembly, but that's okay. It's the most important thing. It's the reason why we're there. You see, and if you need to take 5 minutes from this and 5 minutes from that, that's fine. Take it. Tell the preacher he's going to have to preach a shorter sermon. 5 minutes shorter sermon, and tell the song leader, the singing part, 5 minutes shorter singing. That gives you 10 minutes. Okay? Doesn't Jesus deserve 10 minutes? I think he does. Weekly observance of the Lord's Supper, it's so important. So important. Well, I hope you'll think about these things. I hope they will help you maybe refocus your own thoughts about the importance of communion, the importance of the Lord's Supper, and think about why we do this every week. And as you're doing that, I would encourage you to read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.